It's definitely good to be with you once again, to be able to talk about the Christian and technology. And in this particular case, this evening, we're going to be considering the topic of the automobile. Now, when we think of technology, that may not be the first thing that comes to mind. When we think of technology, we might think of computers, tablets, cell phones, and smartphones, and the like. You know, we often think of technology in terms of something that's really recent. And so say something like the iPhone, this was, just came onto the market a little bit more than, 10 years ago. So we think of those types of things. And at the same time, we may not realize it, but one of the technologies that has, in many ways, we could say, irreversibly changed the church. It has irreversibly changed the church. It's the automobile. You know, if we recognize that, say, that New Testament church history is 2,000 years old, then 5% of the last 2,000 years accounts for the existence of the car. So if 2,000 years were a 24-hour clock, then the car was only invented 1 hour and 12 minutes ago. So in that sense, we can say that, at least from the standpoint of 2,000 years of church history, the car is a relatively recent innovation. Now, as we've looked at the other types of technology over the past couple of weeks, we want to note similar things about this type of technology, that is the car, and that there are many benefits. But as we note the benefits, we don't want to think that there are only benefits. We want to recognize that there are ways in which we become weaker. Some things we become stronger, and in other ways we become weaker. For every 2 steps forward, sometimes in other areas we take an entire step or more back. And so what we want to be able to do at this point is we want to try to understand how it is that the automobile has changed the church, so that we can properly use our cars rather than allowing our automobiles to deform our relationship to the church and even to deform the nature of the church itself. And so what we're going to do is we're going to look first by looking at the church before and after the automobile. So that's going to require us to do the best that we can to take a step back into time, even if it's ever so briefly. If you ever watched, I'm really going to date myself now, Rocky and Bullwinkle. Maybe some of you have seen those cartoons and reruns or what have you. We're going to step back into Mr. Peabody's Wayback Machine. And we're going to go look back into time as to what the church looked like before the car. And then look at it after the car. And then secondly, we want to think about the nature of our relationship to the church, in that we don't want the car to adversely affect the way that we relate to the church. And so we want to treat our church relationship more like a marriage than like a membership, although it is a membership. So the church before and after the automobile. Secondly, treating the church like a marriage. And then third, we'll make some concluding observations about the things that we've discussed. So let's enter Mr. Peabody's Wayback Machine, and let's think about the church before and then after the automobile. In that so often it's the case that when we think about things or think about technologies, it's difficult for us to imagine what it was like before the technology existed. You know, I think my kids, I remember we were having a conversation, and they said, well, Dad, when you were a kid, how is it that you would find things if you were looking for a store or what have you? And I said, it was the Yellow Pages, and many of you know what the Yellow Pages are. Some of you don't know what the Yellow Pages are. You've maybe never even seen the Yellow Pages. And they were like, well, Father, please explain how these Yellow Pages worked. And so, I sit there and I say, well, you had the listing, alphabetical, topical, all kinds of different ways to slice the pie, and you would look up a sporting goods store or what have you, and you had ads, etc. Well, it was difficult for them to conceive of how this book functioned. Why? Because you just look at the internet, type in what you need, address, map, phone number, and you're off to the races. So what was the church like before the car? Let's try to take that step back. Think, for example, say in the Middle Ages. Middle Ages would have been from about 600 AD until about 1500 AD, maybe 1450, but who's counting? The Middle Ages, essentially, if you lived in the Middle Ages, you would likely live on the estate of a nobleman. The estate of a nobleman. Where you would have a village, and in that village or nearby that village would be a small church. Okay, sometimes larger estates had several villages and several churches, and so the area in which a church resided was called a parish. In cities, there were naturally greater concentrations of people. And so there would typically be a larger number of churches within a city rather than off in a village parish. But village and city churches had one thing in common, or at least one thing in common, is that people walked to church. People walked to church. Or perhaps if you were wealthy or had a little bit of greater financial means, you might ride a horse to church. Or perhaps in later times you would have a wagon or have access to a wagon. So what this meant is that I suspect that for the average person that the church that they attended might have been somewhere between the neighborhood of, say, 3 to 5 miles walking distance from their home to where their church was. When I was in graduate school, I was in Scotland. And I know I was a grown adult, but I was deathly afraid of trying to rent a car or trying to own a car because of driving on the other side of the road. I once rode with a friend who is an American, and he said, yeah, just remember when we pull out, say it with me, stay on the left, stay on the left, stay, or was it the left? Yeah, stay on the left, yeah. Stay on the left, stay on the left, stay on the left, so that we wouldn't pull out on the wrong side of the road. And I thought, this is really making me nervous because it's making me think that you're totally unqualified to drive here. So I was scared of doing that. And then the bus system seemed completely foreign to me. I just couldn't figure out if I had to take this bus or this, forget it, I'll just walk. And so it was a 2-mile walk each way to church, and it took me about 30 minutes. Sometimes in the rain, going sideways. Sometimes it would be really cold and I would get to church and I couldn't feel my face, but that's the way it was. For me, that was somewhat out of the norm because I was used to driving to church when I was here in the States. But that was actually quite the regular experience for your person living in a medieval village, just walking to church, whether in rain, sleet, or snow, or in sunny weather. And so, if a church went liberal, if your local village church went liberal, there was really not much of anything that you could do about it. Because it wasn't like you would say, okay, I'm going to go to the next town over, the next village over, and I'll go to church over there. It might be too far for you to walk, or at least too far for you conceivably to walk on any given Sunday. And so you are essentially stuck. So what this means in terms of, say, the characteristics of a local village church is that the entire church's membership lived within walking distance of their church. Churches were therefore embedded in their local communities. Churches, therefore, you can imagine, were close-knit communities. One of the patterns that you might see in an ancient medieval village is that you were born in that village, you went to that church your entire life, and you died in that village. You might never leave the vicinity of, say, 15 miles to 20 miles from around the place where you were born. That just was the nature of life. And so we could say in this vein that church members were essentially held captive to their local church. Now, you might have another option if you lived, say, in a city where there was a higher concentration of people and therefore a higher concentration and number of churches. But even then, if you wandered from one church to another for whatever reason, the pastor your pastor was likely close enough that he could consult with the other pastor. Say, for example, in 16th century Geneva, Switzerland, where John Calvin ministered, there were at least initially 9 pastors there in Geneva, the pastors of 9 different churches. And if you've ever been to Geneva, Switzerland, you'll note that you can probably walk your way around the city. It might take you a while, but so you could conceivably go from one church to another if you were unhappy with one particular congregation or the pastor of one particular church. But because all local 9 pastors met weekly, they would meet for study and prayer. They might say, hey, I noticed that Joe showed up this morning, or last week, this past Sunday. Is everything okay? Well, no, actually, we had a falling out. So what the pastor would do is say, okay, Joe, you need to go back. And in fact, if you don't go back, we'll put you under church discipline. And they were very serious about church discipline. It was a very different period of time. I love the 16th century in many ways. I love to study it, love to read about it. It's absolutely fascinating. I'm inspired by the theologians and the people that lived in that day, but I never would want to live in the 16th century. I love antibiotics. I love indoor plumbing. I love central heat and air. Those are tremendous blessings. But in addition to that, they took church discipline really, really, really seriously. There was an account that occurred in 16th century Geneva where some men were carousing one evening in the city. They became inebriated and began to sing essentially lascivious songs about the Lord's Supper. It's an odd thing to do. I have no idea why they would do it. It makes no sense whatsoever to me. Completely foreign. They were arrested. They were put in jail. And then the church, brought them before the elders of the church. They were deemed guilty of blaspheming the supper. And so part of their punishment, among other things, was having their tongues run through with a hot iron. Different time. Rough time in many respects. So they took church discipline really seriously, so that if you wandered from one church to another without really having a solid reason, chances are you would be herded back to your church. So even if you lived in a city where you had other church options, chances are you would still have to worship at your particular congregation. Okay, so that's the step back into the Wayback Machine. Well, now let's kind of move forward into history a little bit. And let's think about how the automobile changes all of this. In a pamphlet from the early 20th century, or as my children call it, Dad, aren't you from the 1900s? Yes, I am. It says, the day of the horse is gone. The automobile has driven him from the roads. The boys and men and women of this generation must have automobiles. That's from a pamphlet, some of the advertising in the early 20th century. According to a lot of the advertisements that you would see and the ideas that were promoting the car, is that cars could save lives. How could they save lives? Well, because now you wouldn't necessarily have to wait for the doctor to come to you on horseback, or it wasn't a long trip to the doctor or to the hospital. You could put somebody in a car and you could rush them off to the hospital and get them into medical care right away. Cars were touted as being able to prevent crime. Why? Well, because police officers no longer had to walk their beats. They could drive throughout the cities, and they could get from one place to another quite quickly and respond even to potential crimes very quickly. Well, all of these things were touted to be able to enable people to keep up with the process of a moving world. Well, with the invention of the automobile, churches had to adapt. It used to be that, churches had, decent small pieces of property, a place to tie up horses, maybe. But now, cars take up more space than horses, so churches had to buy the property adjacent to them to create parking lots, something that they didn't necessarily have before the invention of the car. Sometimes churches decided, you know what? Now, with the bustling and hustling interstate system that they're building, and this was done during the Eisenhower administration in the 1950s, churches decided to move out of their local communities and relocate to the highway intersections or major roadways so that they would be visible and that they would be accessible right off the highway so that people could easily get to and from church. Okay, so what this means now is that churches don't necessarily draw their membership from the local community, but rather they might draw their membership from a much greater geographical area. And so there's a sense in which we can say that in some places, the automobile essentially completely eliminated the local parish because now people are coming from all points on the compass rather than being located in one small community where the pastor might be able to, walk from one home to the other home to the next as he goes to visit the members of his church. And this is especially so in the United States, where geography and settlement patterns were very different than, say, the patterns that you see in Europe. In Europe, you have so much that is within walking distance of you or within distance of public transportation that still keeps you relatively close to your local community. Whereas in the United States, so much is so spread out, especially if you're outside of major cities. And I can remember when I was in seminary, there was a gentleman from the UK, from England, who was visiting, and some friends of mine took him out to dinner. I forget where. They went to the local Denny's or something, taking their life into their hands doing that. But they went to the local Denny's, and then they said, okay, afterwards they needed to go to Walmart. And the Walmart was across the road. And this gentleman started to walk, and they said, hey, where are you going? And he says, well, I was just going to walk over to the Walmart. He says, this is the United States. We don't walk anywhere. We drive. Get in the car. And so they got in the car and drove across the street. That little story tells us a little bit of something about the nature of our culture, partially because of geography, partially because the United States grows large in part as in concert with the invention of the automobile. The United States is only around for, say, about 100 years or so, a little bit more than that perhaps, before the automobile hits the scene. Whereas Europe is around for more than 1,000 years before the automobile ever even hits the scene. And so there are different patterns. But what we want to note now about the automobile is we want to keep in mind the car is not value neutral technology. We want to remember that when we're looking at any kind of technology, technology always has values built into it. People have to make moral and ethical decisions about how they make something, the purpose for something, what they seek to accomplish through this particular technology. Okay? And so what people believed about the car is that the car had the capacity for transforming rural America. In fact, Teddy Roosevelt created the Country Life Commission, which was tasked with industrializing rural America. Okay? And so in that sense, we can say that capitalism, with its unquenchable thirst for ever-expanding markets, looked to the automobile as the perfect instrument to be able to implement such ideals and values. So there's a sense in which we can say that the automobile and capitalism go together hand in hand. When you see, for example, gas prices rising, economists say that oil is the lifeblood of our economy. Then that means that the prices of goods begin to rise because it costs more to ship things. Why? Because the vast majority of the consumer goods that we use and purchase come to us by way of automobile or, tractor trailer, 18-wheelers and whatnot. Okay? And so from this vantage point, we can say that cars essentially empower consumers and give businesses the ability to expand their markets, to expand the reach of their business. And so if this is the case, if the car lies behind consumerism, then it shouldn't surprise us to hear this very same kind of consumer mentality begin to make its way into the church. In an advertisement from a pamphlet, I think from around the 40s, it said to buy a Ford, as in the Ford motor car, to buy a Ford does not impoverish ministers, but increases their profitable efficiency. Notice the consumer-laden language that you find here is that the labor of a minister is now being spoken of in terms of efficiency and profitability. That's the language of markets. That's the language of economics. That's the language of business. Because what they're saying is, hey, if you're a minister, you should buy a car because this car will make you more profitable. Well, one of the questions we would want to ask is, well, wait a minute, is ministry really to be measured in terms of profitability? Is ministry to be measured in terms of efficiency? You know, I'm not saying that we should automatically say no to those questions, but I think we would certainly want to answer very carefully to those particular questions. Because if you've had the opportunity to observe ministry, sometimes you can say the very best ministry is sometimes highly inefficient. It's highly inefficient, highly time-consuming. But it may be incredibly beneficial for the people involved because reconciliation, mercy, love, forgiveness are the results of that ministry. But it may be a highly inefficient process. Okay, well, so what happened is that essentially you can say that if cars, for example, if cars turned farmers in rural America into resourceful consumers, well, then they would expect nothing less of their own pastors. You know, if a farmer purchases a car or a truck, a flatbed truck maybe, and says that, you know, ever since buying this car or this truck, I'm able to get my crops to market a lot more quickly. Pastor, how beneficial for you would it be for you to have a car to make you more efficient in your ministry? Okay, well, those are some of the ideas that we want to think of in terms of before the car and now after the car. Let's think about some of the benefits as well as potentially some of the drawbacks. Remember, in all of these talks, I do not come here to say that we need to completely get rid of the technologies that I'm talking about. Rather, we want to be good stewards of the technologies that the Lord has blessed us with. Because I tell you what, it's a tremendous blessing to have an automobile. I drove here in my automobile today. It was great. I enjoyed the ride. You know, it was efficient. And again, some of you younger folks are going to be too young to appreciate this, but some of you in this room will know exactly what I'm talking about. You know, when my parents bought their 1979 Honda Civic for $4,500, it didn't come with air conditioning. Now, that wasn't a big deal if you were living in San Francisco or in the Bay Area where we did, because it didn't get too hot. But when we moved to Georgia and I inherited that car as a 16-year-old, oh, golly. Going to church on Sundays, you had to move fast. Roll down the windows, pop the two wings open in the back, and move. Otherwise, if you didn't keep that convection air going, you would really sweat a lot worse than if you just did with, you know, the convection going. So it was only, say, in the mid-'80s that I think that air conditioning became standard feature in the car, so don't get me wrong. There's a ton of benefits to cars, especially air-conditioned cars. You know, people who live in remote areas can attend churches that are beyond walking distance. So that's a blessing. That's great. Ministers, conversely, can go and minister to people in remote areas and in remote communities, which is another fantastic blessing. For my own denomination, the Orthodox Presbyterian Church, I've heard our missionaries from Uganda talk about the fact that they get in their Land Cruiser when they pick somebody up from the airport, and it takes them something like 6 hours by Land Cruiser to get from the airport to where their mission is located. But that it would take them an inordinately longer amount of time to get there if it was by foot or I'm not sure what other means of travel there would be. Maybe it's horse, maybe it's probably, donkey. But so you can reach remote people in remote areas. If a church goes south, if a church goes liberal, then you can go and find another faithful church by getting in your car and driving away. I've heard over the years in my time in the pastorate of some families sometimes driving more than an hour each way to get to church. So there are some tremendous blessings to the automobile. Don't get me wrong. I love the car, okay, and from that vantage point. But on the other hand, there are some drawbacks. There are some drawbacks. In what ways do we grow stronger? In what ways do we become weaker? Well, remember what I said, that cars and consumerism go hand in hand. Cars and consumerism go hand in hand. As I said, oil is the lifeblood of our economy. A number of months ago, I went over to, I don't know what to call them these days, but it's the fancy schmancy mall over there in Ridgeland. That's it's like a little community, and it's got all the different stores. What's that? Renaissance. It's not a strip mall, but it's a fancy strip mall, right? And so I went into the Apple store there because I needed to get a part for my computer. And so I went in there, and the salesman asked me, he said, "Oh, so where are you from?" And I was like, just right over here in Madison. And he says, "Oh, the reason I ask is because sometimes we get people as, far north as Little Rock, and then as far away as, say, Shreveport or New Orleans, or sometimes from south of the state, because we're one of the few Apple stores within the region." It's like, okay, that's interesting. Notice the pattern. If the Apple store isn't in your local community, you get in the car, and some people think nothing of, say, driving 2 to 3 hours to get to the Apple store, 2 to 3 hours back. Some people do that. That's okay. That's fine. Okay? But how many of you remember, and maybe, again, I'm dating myself. I do that as of late a lot, but I guess it's been such a long time since I've watched real television. But when I was a kid, I used to watch Little House on the Prairie. Remember that show? Michael Landon, Half Pint. It was a show where there was always like a tornado, somebody's dying, and everybody's always crying at the end of this show. And as a child, it's like, I don't know if I can take any more emotional terrorism. I have to watch something with a happy ending, which was only like 1 or 2 shows a season, it seemed like, had a happy ending. But when they needed to get something, they had to go to the Nelson's Mercantile in town, in Walnut Grove. And if the Mercantile didn't have it, then they could order it. Or if Charles needed to get something really desperately, he might ride into Mankato, wherever that was, right? So he'd ride the horse or ride the wagon into Mankato to get whatever it is that they needed. Very, very limited options. Whereas now, with your car, you can kind of go wherever you need to go. You're not limited by distance. You're only limited really by your own desire as to how far or how much time you want to spend in the car. So in this sense, if your local market doesn't carry whatever it is that you want, that widget, then you can drive to another market, to another store to get it. You can even drive to another one in another city, another town, or another state. It's like my son has gotten into airsoft as of late, and he's desperate to go to an airsoft field, I guess so that he can shoot other people. And he's grown tired of shooting his brother. I got shot once, left big old welts on me, and I'm like, okay, we're done with this. I no more suffering. But I think there's one like he wants to go to that's on the border. Well, in a previous generation, a father would have said, no, just shoot your brother in the backyard and leave me alone. But now you can say, okay, let's get in the car and let's drive 2 hours. and let's go. Well, just as the car has transformed our consumerism and our purchasing habits, it's transformed many church members into church consumers. You know, if controversy embroils a church, you get in your car and you drive away and you don't come back, even if it means driving at a great distance to another church. If your church tries to exercise church discipline against you and you don't like it, you get in your car and you drive away and you don't ever come back. If your church doesn't necessarily meet all of your demands or your desires, you get in your car and you drive away and you go to a different church. It's turned us more into church consumers, or it certainly has that capacity to turn us into church consumers rather than into church members. Okay, so if those are the strengths and the drawbacks, as we focus particularly upon remedying the potential pitfalls, how can we do this? And this brings up our second point, which is treating our church and our church membership more like a marriage rather than something to be consumed as a product. And that we cannot turn back the clock. You know, there's no sense in which we can say, let's just all get rid of our cars. You know, never going to happen. I frankly would much rather take my car to the dealership for an oil change than to sweep out and to clean out the garage from the horse. You know, don't want to go back to that. The Amish have done that. You know, I don't want you to think nobody does that. Some communities have turned back the clock. So the Amish are all about the horse and buggy. They don't want to embrace the technology of the car. There's a reason behind it for them. So I don't think we can turn back the clock. We can and should celebrate the blessing that the car is, as I said. But the big, I think, idea that we should hold on to is that just because we can drive away from our church doesn't mean that we should. Doesn't mean that we should. You know, when we join the church, we take a vow of membership. And I probably, since, I'm in a PCA church, I should have looked up the BCA, book of church order, but I'm sure that the PCA BCO has something very similar to this particular statement that comes from my own denomination's BCO. Do you promise to participate faithfully in this church's worship and service, to submit to the Lord, to its government, and to heed its discipline, even in case you should be found delinquent in doctrine or life? You know, in other words, are you going to submit to the authority of the church? Are you going to participate faithfully in the life of the church? Well, that statement, at least in the broader culture, and maybe with even the broader church, might wrinkle a few noses. But it's ultimately a reflection of the teaching of Scripture. We read, for example, in Hebrews chapter 13, verse 17, "Obey your leaders and submit to them, for they are keeping watch over your souls as those who will have to give an account. Let them do this with joy and not with groaning, for that would be of no advantage to you." You know, so when it comes, say, to our church membership, especially as it pertains to something like church discipline, if the church and the session and the pastors determine that you've sinned and they've deemed that discipline is a necessary remedy, by getting into your car and driving away and not returning, you may be driving away from the very thing that you so desperately need. You know, if you were in the doctor's office and the doctor says, you have a serious illness and here's the medication, but it may be painful to administer, but it'll save your life. And you said, no, I don't want the pain, and you leave and you drive away. That's sometimes what can happen because we misuse the technology of the car. Same thing we could say and make the observation from the Scriptures about the factionalism that plagued the New Testament church from its very beginning. In Corinth, you know, Paul in 1 Corinthians 3 recounts that some followed Paul, some followed Apollos. You know, in Rome, there was the meat-eating faction in Romans chapter 14, and then the vegetarian faction, those who believed that eating meat was wrong and sinful. I mean, we know that that's wrong. You know, I mean, I would be first tri-tip Presbyterian of Rome, right? because we know how tasty and good meat is. All you have to do is smell it and know that it's right. Okay, you know? But Paul's point here is he's saying, hey, don't let something like food divide the body of Christ. Had the church at Rome had access to vehicles, I wonder if they might have decided, let's start a meat-eating church over here and we're driving away. Or let's start a vegetarian church and we're driving away and leaving all those meat-eaters behind. You know, would there have been First Church of Paul of Corinth, First Vegetarian Presbyterian of Rome? These churches didn't have the option of getting in their cars and driving away. So they had to follow Paul's counsel and recognize that Paul and Apollos didn't die for the Corinthians, but that they were all one body in Christ. They had to figure out how to work it out. Meat eaters and vegetarians had to learn how to love one another so that the meat eaters wouldn't censoriously look at their weaker brothers and you know, roll over their convictions and their weak faith. And they had to learn to say, no, this is one for whom Christ died. And if Christ died for my brother, however weak in his faith he might be, I need to be sacrificial in my love towards him, not get in the car and drive away and leave him behind. And so what this means, I think, is that the remedy here to ensuring that we don't misuse the technology of the car is to try to treat our church membership more like a marriage. More like a marriage. You know, the Bible has very, very, very few reasons for allowing divorce. Infidelity, and then very carefully defined abandonment. Now, while our church membership isn't as strict as our marriage commitment, in other words, when you join the church, you don't say, till death do us part, so it's not as strict, we should only ideally leave a church when it ceases to bear one of the three marks of the church, which is the right preaching of the gospel, the right administration of the sacraments, and the right administration of discipline. Preaching, sacraments, and discipline. You know, so when a church, for example, develops doctrinal problems, where we know that there's a significant doctrinal issue, what should we do? Should we just get in the car and drive away? I don't think so. Not immediately. We should stay, pray, and obey. We should do our best to keep our membership vows. We should pray and say, Lord, help me to exercise patience in the midst of this trying circumstance. Help me to pray, O Lord, on behalf of the church leaders as they wrestle through this challenging and difficult issue. We should submit to the authority of the pastor and the elders and the session. Let's say, for example, that a church, you say, you know, you're a member and you're dissatisfied, say, for example, because you feel as if it has a lack of outreach. You know, it's just not as warm and as friendly as I would hope it to be. I've been here for a number of years. Well, I would say before you get in your car and you drive away, instead, seek to become the change that you desire to see. You know, not only should you pray for your church, you know, that its outreach would improve, that it would be a warm and loving congregation, but then start to be the change that you hope to see. Start reaching out to people. Be that smiling face on a Sunday morning that greets people. Rope other people in the process and say, hey, would you like to come over for fellowship at my home? Would you like to share a meal? I'd love to get to know you better. And, you know, let's get to know each other in this way. You know, for a lot of people that can be intimidating. It's like, oh, I'm not a good host, this and that. You know, I'm not a very good cook. And I'm like, you know what? It's not about the food. All you need is a king-size bag of Cheetos and a 3-liter of Coke, and you got fellowship. It may not be the best of food, but it's not so much about the food. It's about the people, right? It's about the people. You go to Costco and get one of those barrels of cheese balls. Those things don't last but like 5 minutes at my house. That's why we don't buy them. Can you provide meals for people in the church? Can you host people in your home? Can you offer to teach Sunday school, help out with the children, help out wherever there is need? If the church, for example, makes decisions with which you disagree, you've probably heard the saying, you get 5 Presbyterians in a room, you're going to get 6 opinions. That's so true. I've been in that room many a time, right? Well, if the church makes a decision with which you disagree, humbly submit and echo Christ's humility in your own life, rather than getting in the car and saying, I've got to find the church that agrees entirely with me. If the church, again, exercises discipline against you, remember, as we read in Hebrews 12:8, God is treating you as sons. For what son is there whom his father does not discipline? Now, some of these situations you might think, I don't know, some of these situations can be hard. What happens if there are broken relationships? What happens if there are wounded hearts? And this is where I want to say I suspect that this will undoubtedly be the case in a number of these different circumstances. But there was a book that I read. He's a philosopher, economist, kind of a jack of all trades. His name is Nassim Taleb, and his book is called Anti-Fragile. He says that in life, so often it's the case that we try to flee adverse circumstances because we're afraid of them. We're afraid of the difficulty. We're afraid of the pain. He says, believe it or not, we should actually be seeking difficulty. We should be seeking the challenges. Why on earth would we want to do that? Because he says it's in the midst of those difficulties that you either will die or you will thrive and you will grow stronger from the challenge. I'm no medical doctor, as my wife is fond of reminding me. Because one of the kids are sick and I'm like, well, why don't you do this? And she's like, you're not a real doctor. And I say, but I am a doctor, and you have to listen to me, right? What I do know, and I remember this from being a kid when I broke my arm, is that the doctor said, well, yeah, at the break, that's going to heal. And believe it or not, at that break, it's actually going to become stronger than it was before the break. When there's a broken relationship, if you get in the car and you leave, you lose the opportunity to be able to make that broken relationship stronger, because you lose the opportunity and you lose the occasion to see forgiveness, to receive grace, to have God, through His Spirit and through the gospel of Christ, work in the midst of that situation so that there can be reconciliation, so that that relationship can be made stronger and healthier, so that it can begin to be able to weather any difficulty or trial. You make it fragile, and you rob yourself of the opportunity for greater degrees of sanctification, greater opportunities for conformity to the image of Christ by driving away, essentially stunting your spiritual growth. Now, I'm not saying that it's going to be easy to get in the midst of those situations and to seek reconciliation. It's probably going to be very difficult. But this is where we have to remember that in the midst of those challenges, praise God, He is greater and more powerful and more merciful than any of our sins, so that He can bring about that reconciliation, that restoration of the relationship. So, in conclusion, I think we should take something from the traditional marriage vows and apply them to our church membership vows. Not formally, but just informally. From this day forward, for better, for worse, for richer, for poor, in sickness and in health, until death do us part. In other words, we should say, we should only leave a church unless there's a really, really solid biblical reason. And after we have patiently worked really hard to figure the situation out and to see if there's any opportunity, any avenue, any open window for reconciliation and restoration. But for sure, bottom line, we should never let our cars turn us into church consumers. Even when things get difficult, seek to love the church as Christ has loved us. Be long-suffering, patient, and sacrificial, abilities that only come from the grace of God in Christ. But if things come to a breaking point where the church ceases to bear one of the three marks, then and only then should you seriously consider leaving. I don't think that irreconcilable differences, as much as that may be a commonly cited reason for divorce in our day, albeit unbiblical, should be a reason that we immediately get in the car and drive away from our churches, never to return again. Remember this: just because you can drive away from your church doesn't mean that you should. Thank you.